preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
This is the last of our series on Martin Buber. The title tonight is Let Us Dare to Trust Encounter with Social Problems. When I view the various ways in which you were seated throughout the house, I can see why he was concerned with At the very time when McCall's magazine was having large ads advertising togetherness, the whole staff of McCall's resigned. Nonetheless, it is a curious thing that in this country, many people who know Buber in terms of the I and thou relationship do not really understand that he was a socialist and that he was concerned with political and social problems, and they imagine that he was only interested in an individual, one-to-one, man-to-man relationship. I'll read you what I have planned for tonight. Buber's situational ethics, his approach to love, pacifism, civil disobedience, Arab-Jewish rapprochement, post-war relations between Israel and Germany, and the problem of creating peace through genuine dialogue. The term situational ethics is not a Buberian term, and I gather of late that it has come into some prominence through a man I know by the name of Joseph Fletcher at the Episcopal Theological Seminary in Cambridge, and I don't really know what it means. So let's rather say that Buber has an ethics of the situation. That is, he says you have to choose between ism and situation. And that does not mean that we live only from moment to moment in unconnected moments. But it does mean that the weight of emphasis cannot fall upon the abstract ideology or the universal moral principle. Yet it used to be thought, until fairly recently, that the only alternative to the holding of some universal Platonic principle or some abstract universal of one sort or another was either cultural relativism, in which we said, well, each culture simply does what it does for the reasons that it does, and its values can be reduced finally to its needs, its self-interest. Or someone like Sartre would hold that if you do not have any objective human nature, then it is up to you to invent values. Values are nothing other than the meaning which you choose. Well, that, says Buber, is exactly what Nietzsche said, and it's no truer since he said it. But what Sartre is implying is that there are only two alternatives, the objective and the subjective. And I must confess that the question that Buber raises in connection with Sartre's ethics is a question which I myself have never been able to see around. And that is, values, not as abstractions, but as John Dewey would say, as valuing, as valuation, or Nietzsche would say, it is valuing which makes man a human being. Values as a direction-giving principle cannot be reduced to something which we arbitrarily decide and say, from now on this will be true, or perhaps agree with a number of other people. Now, Sartre, of course, does not accept the charge of arbitrariness because he makes his decisions in a situation, and that is true. On the other hand, he makes his decisions not with reference to the situation, but with reference to the individual himself. That is, he does not discover the moral ought in the betweenness of a situation to which he is open and to which he responds. He discovers it in the relative good faith or lack of good faith, the bad faith, mauvaise foi, in one's relationship to oneself. The situation is the occasion, of course, for we do, as Sartre says, live in a world of intersubjectivity. It is the occasion, but it is nonetheless not that which gives us any direction or guideline. Buber, in contrast to Sartre, says we do not invent values. We discover them in our meeting with being. And when he says we discover them, he does not mean they are already there. He means that values are the product of this meeting with a being which is not ourselves, a world which we did not establish. Even our own existence we did not establish, and the meeting between ourselves and the world we did not establish, but in this meeting we do come on values. That is exactly what Albert Camus says in the book The Rebel, Nothing justifies us, says Camus, in saying that these values existed from all eternity. But they do exist with us in history. And in history, we fight against oppression and tyranny, and we try to establish freedom and truthfulness, and we do so only in the common dialogue of man with man, the dialogue which recognizes a limit, the dialogue which is the opposite of ideology, because it does not try to impose its truth upon the other side when the other side has been successfully defeated, and establish a new tyranny to replace the old, but rather it tries to establish the human situation in which each has a point of view and has something to say. Albert Camus and Gabriel Marcel are both French existentialists, and they are both what I call, and to deny our nothingness, existentialists of dialogue. But Camus reproaches Marcel because Marcel is concerned, let's say, about one situation, let's say when the Hungarians torture prisoners, but not about another, let's say in Algeria or in the Spanish, in the terms of the Spanish Civil War. And Camus says we have to protest in every situation in order to keep alive the dialogue which is human existence. The choice, however, is not between situation and norm, if norm means some sort of a guideline. The choice is only which do you put first. Do you say that the norm is the first thing and the situation you merely apply it, or is it the other way around? Do you instead have the situation, and then the norm is only a rule of thumb on the basis of which you can perhaps say, this may apply here or it may not. Did I tell you the story about Buber's first school? I think perhaps I did. He was kept at home, being educated in a language-centered humanism until he was at least 10 years of age. And then he went to this school in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which he said was really an anachronism in our day, where people wanted to tolerate each other without understanding each other. They wanted mutual tolerance without mutual understanding. And in this school, there were a majority of Polish Catholic students and a minority of Jewish students. The Ruthenians had schools of their own. And Buber tells that every day when they came in and they turned and the master turned to the crucifix behind his desk, the students rose and they recited the Trinity formula in common. And he said, we Jews stood with our heads bowed to the floor, having to be a thing in a sacral ritual in which no drama of my being could take part. And this, as we will remember, was the basis of Buber's opposition to every missionary effort to people who have roots of their own. Because his objection was not to discrimination or to intolerance, his objection was to the attempt not to see the existence of another point of view. Now, this first story of school is very deeply related, closely related to a second story that Buber tells, and one which, as vividly as any that he has ever told, illustrates what would be meant by his ethics of situation. In this presumably one-room schoolhouse, the boys sat on benches, each with his assigned place. Buber said he had a friend who sat next to him for 8 years on the same bench. And he said one fall, when otherwise the boys would have gone out to the recess and stormed around in the recess to the playground and stormed around and played and talked with each other in small groups during the recess, one fall was utterly spoiled by rain. And the boys had to sit quietly on the benches. And during this period, 2 boys undertook to entertain the other boys in pantomimes, in mimic games, trying to keep their faces severely silent in order not to attract the attention of the master. But after a few weeks, this game took on an unmistakably sexual character, and the faces of these boys looked like the faces of the souls damned and tormented in hell which he said his Catholic classmates knew how to tell him about in the tone of experts. And every movement was cruelly strained and forced. After this had gone on for a couple of weeks, and the boys had silently observed and had not discussed it with each other, the master called the young Buber, now 12 years old, into his office. When the young Buber, young Martin, came in, he greeted him in that voice which they knew as invariably gentle and kindly, and said to him, "Tell me what you know of those two boys." "I know nothing," he screamed. And then the master, in the same gentle and considerate voice, said, "We know you well. You are a good boy. You will help us." "Help? Help whom?" I wanted to shout, Buber recounts, but instead I fell into a weeping as never before in my life and was led away almost unconscious. But he said, the last look that I had of the master, which I remembered when I got home, was not that kind and considerate look, but a frightened one. I was kept at home for 2 weeks. When I returned to school, the bench on which those two boys sat was empty and remained empty for the rest of the school year. Buber appends to this story a remarkable conclusion. He said, "With this convulsion of my childhood, I began that long series of lessons that taught me the problematic relation between maxim and situation, and the true norm which commands not our obedience but ourselves." What is the problematic relation between maxim and situation? Buber tells us in the essay Education of Character and Between Man and Man, no responsible person is a stranger to norms, but for all that, the norm does not become a habit or a precept or a maxim. A maxim, if you think of Benjamin Franklin, early to bed, and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. A maxim addresses everybody and it addresses nobody. A maxim speaks of the one, but it does not speak to you. But what Buber asks does the situation demand of you? It demands nothing that is prepared, nothing that is beforehand. It demands response, it demands responsibility, it demands you. Because a maxim demands one, it cannot address you in the situation. Why not? Well, the first reason is the reason which I think I've mentioned before, which arises out of the very nature of dialogue, that it takes place in time. As Franz Rosenzweig said, in real dialogue, the other person has not only ears but a mouth. He may say something that will surprise you. If he may say something that will surprise you, then you cannot be prepared. You cannot know in advance the moral answer to this situation because you have not heard the question that the situation addresses to you. But the second reason why a maxim cannot be a moral address is that the maxim does not speak to you as a whole person. It speaks to you rather as the one. It leaves out both the situation that addresses you and you in your unique response to that situation. Help. Help whom? What did the master want? He obviously knew about those two boys, or he wouldn't have asked the young Buber about it. So what did he want from the young Buber? He wanted confirmation. He wanted confirmation in being the master who would separate the good boys from these two bad boys. But the young Buber had sat there with the other boys, observing silently and not discussing what was going on. And he had felt the pain and confusion and torment of those two boys. And he and all the other boys had perhaps shared in that pain and torment and confusion, because they were at the very age when such things can be most tormenting and confusing. And now the master was asking the young Buber, who perhaps up to that point had always identified the good with helping the authority and had always received in turn for it the confirmation, you are a good boy. But now the master was asking the young Buber for something that suddenly he saw he could not give, because it was not the master who needed the help, although God knows he needed help. It was those boys, it was Buber himself, it was the other boys who took part in it. He could not respond morally to the situation, for Buber defines moral response as a response with the whole being, and obviously he was cleaven into two. He went off in a convulsion. But at least he began to know that something different might be demanded of him than a general maxim. And of course, this leads us to the second statement he made, the difference between the true norm and the false. The true norm demands not your obedience, but yourself. And that means the true norm is an address that calls forth your response from where you are with your whole being. Whereas the false norm is that which splits you into two parts, one of which is obedient and one of which is rebellious. And then you cannot be confirmed. For the confirmation that you get, as we saw in connection with Buber's idea of being and seeming, will be only the confirmation of that part of you which conforms while you repress the rest of you. And therefore you know you are not being confirmed for what you are. And on the other hand, if you rebel, you are equally unconfirmed, because in rebelling you know, I am essentially unlovable, I am unacceptable, for I am rebelling against what is good. The I and the thou came to seem in the course of civilization that sort of a heavy tradition down on people's heads. Nietzsche in Thus Spake Zarathustra says, the thou is older than the I, and he meant by that society is older than the individual. Well, it is indeed. And Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra talks about the lion of I will who kills the dragon with 1,000 glittering scales on each one of which is written, thou shalt. But again, this is the repressive force of society. And the thou does not really mean thou. It means one must. And that's what we mostly hear when we hear the Ten Commandments. We hear one must do so-and-so. I'm sure I mentioned how I entered a post office in Cincinnati where it says, this pen is provided for your convenience. And I felt something between me and the government, which I had always regarded as hostile till that moment, some I-thou relationship. And then I looked underneath and it said the penalty for removing it, it cost 1/8 of a cent, I'm sure, is a year in prison or $500 fine. And I realized we were back in the old terms, the government and I, and that I was not a you to them, I was something in a law. I had the fascinating experience today in a class of saying, well, before we go on to consider Bergson further, I want to ask each of you, it was a very small class of 7 advanced students in contemporary philosophy, I want to ask each of you, honestly, does Bergson's intuition of intuition awaken anything responsive in you so that you know what he means? Immediately the girl who had been giving the report said, do you mean, did Bergson mean so-and-so by it? I said, no, that is not at all what I meant. And then she continued and said, well, Bergson, as it were, was saying so-and-so. And then she proceeded to give an objective statement of what one could think or might think or probably would think. And then I turned to another girl in the class and I said, did this first girl answer my question? And she hedged and said, well, she was saying you might do so-and-so. It took the third girl before she could say, I have a gleaning or don't have a gleaning of what Bergson means. And I said, well, let us note in this great accumulation of philosophy that is going upward from the ancients, the medieval, and the modern, the contemporary, these were mostly philosophy majors, that at one moment someone asked you, does this have any meaning to you? But the fact was, it was a tactless question. That has nothing to do with education, nothing to do with anything. You were supposed to think what one would think, what any reasonable man would think, what any philosopher would think, and what you think, of course, is quite beside the point, because you don't get any credits for that. In fact, you're sure to flunk if you say it. So, but this is, of course, the whole secret of the life of dialogue, not subjectivism, where you simply put what you feel ahead of the situation, but something where you do listen, and it may be a cruel situation, and where you respond from where you are. And Buber says in this same essay, in The Education of Character, no man has ever understood the Ten Commandments unless he has understood the thou in it as himself. And he says, I know a man who was once struck by the lightning flash of thou shalt not steal, at a time when he was about to do something very different from stealing and knew he had to do the exact opposite of that. This man was Buber himself, as he told me, and it was not thou shalt not steal, but thou shalt not murder. Although, as he said to me, he was not about to kill anyone. Nonetheless, he knew that what he was about to do, he had to do the opposite and bring all the passion he would put into the one into the other. This is a puzzling position to many people. It seems an exposed, a threatened one. It leads people pretty soon to say, well, Hitler was sincere, and he believed what he believed. Hitler, however, as far as I could understand him, was the exact opposite of this. So far from being the man who was open to the situation, he was the man who was sublimely closed to it, who lived in the world of his own imaginings, and was not responsible, did not have what Buber, speaking in the case of the psychotherapist, I mentioned this last week, has what was called listening obedience to the situation. But I think we kid ourselves if we think that we can fall back on sets of universals and absolutes. And I think we kid ourselves for several reasons. First of all, I have never really met a genuine Platonist. I mean someone who really believed it as Plato did. Oh, there are people like Santayana and so on who have it in the world of imagination, but it becomes very subjective. And even among the so-called religious, there are very few who really hear the voice on Sinai. Some do. All honor to them. Many do not. But apart from that, the concrete meaning of most of the things that we take as moral maxims, whether they are love your neighbor, or humility, or consideration, or kindness, and so on, derives from the situation and points back to the situation, but cannot ever be defined apart from the situation. And that means that the price that you pay for the security of an ism, of a worldview or ideology, whether it's pacifism or socialism or Nazism or internationalism or what have you, is the price of not being able to hear the demand of the present moment and of not being able to respond by bringing not just the present, but all you have ever been in the past in a new way in the response to this present. It means that you cannot follow what Buber calls, and this is one of his most important social concepts, the demarcation line, which has to be drawn each hour anew in order that you take on no more guilt than you have to in this situation. No one can live without destroying life. In our very breathing, we destroy countless bacterial forms. And no community can live without injustice. But that doesn't mean that you adopt once for all and for all time the principle that everything that is necessary for the security of the community justifies from now on every means that we use to our end. People who follow this principle, says Buber, who say we will take on ourselves the sacrifice in order that the next generation may be in utopia or what have you, their children are usually hypocrites or tormented. Buber's approach to love, I think we've seen this before, is very consonant with this. He does not hold that all of dialogue is love or can be love in the first place. He does not hold that love is an idea or a feeling. It is a genuine betweenness in a situation, the response of an I to a thou, the responsibility of an I for a thou, the carrying of the presence of the other from situation to situation. And as such, it must be concrete. It cannot be either the eros that ascends to the absolute as in Plato's Symposium, nor even the agape that descends, or even as seen as, in the words of Romano Guardini, as a sort of an electric circuit that comes around. It has to be something genuinely between. Again, I'm sure I mentioned the story of the two peasants, the Hasidic story, where the Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassow said, I learned to love when I heard these peasants speaking to each other, and one said, do you love me? The other said, sure, I love you. Do you really love me? Certainly I love you. You sure you love me? I love you as a brother. And he said, you don't love me. You don't know what I lack. You don't know what I need. You don't know me and my uniqueness. You think you love me, but I am left out in the cold because you don't mean me. Buber had a very un-English use of the term mean, though he used it in English. I mean you, meaning it is really you I have in mind. Now, the only thing wrong with the phrase, this hurts me worse than it hurts you, that the parent uses as he vigorously spanks the child, is the fact that it's extremely difficult for the child to believe it. And that is, first of all, because it does really hurt the child, and the parent is not visibly being hurt, certainly not crying. But secondly, it's not a little likely, in fact, it's very likely, that the parent is doing it for the child's own good. And that means that the parent sees the child's good from its side and is imposing on the child what it holds to be its good. Well, that is one of the things that you have to do as a parent. You have to set limits, and you have to have notions of the child's good. And yet it doesn't carry very far, very long. Because if the child somehow becomes aware that the parent thinking of his good is proceeding by rules of whatever sort, whether they're Dr. Spock or the most liberal progressive educator in the world or the most conservative, doesn't matter. If the child becomes aware that the parent does not really mean him, that he does not make him present and confirm him as a person, inducing his inmost self-becoming, as Buber would put it, by imagining the real, by experiencing concretely what the other thinks, feels, and wills, then the other is left out in the cold. And of course, it's twice as insulting to be told that this is being done for your own good when, in fact, you know that this person has no real image of you. I remember once walking down from Muir Woods. Any of you who have been to San Francisco, it was a wonderful section of redwoods. And this was long ago when I was very young and foolish, and I was walking with a girl whom I thought was in some difficulty, and I tried to talk with her, and I seemed to be getting no place. And so I thought I would illustrate something from my own experience that would apply to what she said. So I said it. She said, that's just like you, so selfish, always talking about yourself. So I got quite no place. But this is standard. The problem being there is a mistrust. There's a mistrust which comes, I'm afraid, very early on. When you take the basic problem, let's say, of proportionate justice in Aristotle, and you say, I have a child of 3, a child of 5, and a child of 7, therefore I will give 3 potato chips to the child of 3, 5 potato chips to the child of 5, and 7 potato chips to the child of 7. That's all well and good, even if you could get, as you cannot, equal-sized potato chips. But how are you going to convey to the children that you really love them equally, even though the 5-year-old needs 5 and the 7-year-old needs 7 potato chips? This, I think, is more difficult. And if you explain to the child that only in a matter of a few years, if he should live so long, he would get 4 more potato chips, this is no help either. I'm saying, in other words, someone accosted me after the lecture 2 times ago, I think it was, when I said, perhaps there is no way in life to quite make up for the lack of confirmation which you do not receive from your parents. Confirmation of you as you, even though your friends and your teachers and your psychoanalysts and your ministers and everyone else, it certainly will help you along the way. And someone said, isn't that terribly unjust? And I said, yes, it is terribly unjust, but I think that is the way it is. It's just as unjust as our creation itself. If we follow this approach to love, something opens up from it. That is an approach to reconciliation, which first of all does not assume that you can always love in every situation, which secondly says every situation has 2 sides, and that anyone who tries to come and see only one side is missing the situation, and anyone who tries to come and see it from above is missing the situation. And therefore, pacifism as an ism, Buber abjured, not because he did not believe in working for peace and building the covenant of peace, not because he did not believe, for he did, that the peacemaker was indeed the most blessed of men, and that peace is built in the boundary between community and community, and church, and country and country. But because he started with the situation and said, what is the possibility in this situation of building? And it's not a question of an ideal and a compromise, but of an historical situation, a demand, and you're, as an individual, as a group, as a nation, responding as you can to that situation. That is universal techniques, shibboleths, whether you say nonviolent resistance does it or love does it, would be out the window from this standpoint. Can you really say that there is love without power? Buber asks in one of his poems that's going to be published in A Believing Humanism. Love is always with power. And there is no such thing as love without injustice too. But there is a reality building in the social depths which cannot be merely equated with non-war, or with keeping the Cold War from becoming a hot war, or with political treaties, or disarmament conferences. A reality of a covenant of peace which is a social thing, which has to do not just with the interhuman in the sense of the I-thou relationship, but of what Buber calls the essential we. Not necessarily the intimacy of a small community, but a community in which people are ready to have to deal with each other, and a community of communities in which these communities are ready to meet with each other. This means a realism which does not say, I will be able or we will be able to create peace, but also does not say we will not be able. It does not come to the situation saying, there's no use talking because we know they won't talk. It goes and it tries to talk. I was asked either last week or the time before last about how can you say this sort of thing, have this view toward conflict when it's impossible for President Johnson and Ho Chi Minh to talk. And I said, well, it's true they can't talk, but partly I believe they can't talk because they won't talk. No one knows quite how much is the situation. I don't pretend to be privy to these things, but it's interesting that in this morning's paper, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who's now really out of the government, got himself a good job at Hunter, I understand, but he said that he began to doubt the good faith of our saying we wanted to negotiate since we were making the terms harder than they were a year ago. I don't know, but I do know that the so-called realism which in advance calculates the other and freezes the other in a position and says he cannot do otherwise because he proceeds from an ideology, because he is a communist or because he is a capitalist or what have you, is violating the possibilities of genuine social building from one situation to the other. I had a situation about a month or so ago that touched me very keenly. A young man whom I had known well. I had been his advisor at Pendle Hill, this Quaker Center in Wallingford, Pennsylvania. And I knew that he had had great difficulty finding his relationship to the state. He was a very sincere Quaker, a very sincere conscientious objector. He had kept up some sort of dialogue with his draft board, but he didn't know whether when it got down to it he could accept the status they were quite ready to give him as a conscientious objector with alternative service, or whether he had to go in another direction and simply not accept the selective service at all. We talked about this, we moved and worked together, and I thought I came to an understanding of a more mature position that he had found, one which recognized that one cannot leave the state, one cannot leave society, that one does remain a member of it, and that's a question of finding the line which you draw in it. However, the situation had gone so far that the selective service turned the matter over to the FBI, and after a number of months, we were told that he was to be arraigned. I wrote a character witness for him, and then told that the day of his trial was to come, that there was really no hope for him at all, that he was certainly going to be sentenced to many years in prison because of this particular judge, but also because there simply was no precedent for anything else. It happened to be the very first day of the second semester at Manhattanville. I could not in good conscience go down, but I wired the judge as I'm sure many of his friends did. He is a man of rare character, and said, I hope that you will, within your interpretation of the law, do the most creative thing that you can find to do, because this young man's real desire is to serve his country in a way compatible with his conscience and his relation to God. Next night when I came home, my wife told me that this young man had called. Now, I knew that if he had called, he couldn't be in prison, because if he had been sentenced, he would have been immediately led away to prison. And yet her face did not express any pleasure or relief, and so I did not respond, and then she said he is not going to accept it. Without waiting to hear more, I went and I called up. I talked to him about an hour from midnight to 1 o'clock, and discovered that the situation was really this, that the judge had said in an unprecedented fashion that he was going to send him back to selective service to go into a hospital, a mental hospital. And his only opposition had been to service which he felt was meaningless, but he didn't feel that way about this, so he said, I think I could accept it. But when he got halfway out of the court, his lawyer and the lawyer for the National Council of Conscience Objectors and the Attorney General came up to him, older men, and they said, in effect, are you going to fish or cut bait? What is this? The judge is asking you to recant. Are you going to recant? And he began to feel he couldn't let down these older men. And he fell into confusion. He saw no way of explaining any other position, and so he said he wasn't going to. And so I said, well, I understood that, but at the same time, that wasn't how I understood his position. We talked, and when I had finished talking with him, he was thoroughly confused, but I think he was still more confused when I began, and I had no notion of what he was going to do. But I did say this, that it was clear to me that there was another position which wasn't defined by this black and white, either you're for or you're against selective service. And that seemed to have been the position he had before. I said, of course, you must decide, and I didn't know what he would do, but I asked him if he'd like me to talk to his lawyer, who happened to be, in fact, an old friend of mine from when I was a conscience objector in camp many years ago. And he said yes. He was so confused he didn't even tell me he lived in New Jersey, but the next day I did get hold of him and talked for about an hour and simply explained that there was another position. I didn't say he should do it, and the lawyer said, that's very interesting. I didn't know him well enough. I'll talk to the judge. And so, sure enough, the new position suddenly took on shape as a reality too, and the thing was sent back to selective service, and he didn't go to prison. I had just finished translating, but I hadn't really read yet my own translation of Martin Buber's Nachlese, his Leaving Humanism. And so I sent, without comment, to this young man 2 things that Buber wrote for the 100th anniversary of the death of Henry Thoreau. Henry Thoreau, you know, is our own great civil disobedient in the United States. You remember the story where Thoreau was objecting to paying taxes for the War of 1848, and because he felt it was an imperialistic war against Mexico. And his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came and said to him, Henry, you know, he was in jail, he said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And he said, Ralph, what are you doing out there? I was very surprised after I copied out these 2 statements of Buber on Thoreau about how very much they did apply to this young man's situation, which was not a question of one abstraction or ideology versus another, as well as our situation in general. Since they're quite short, I want to read them to you. The first, just 1963, is called On Civil Disobedience. And Buber says, it is now nearly 60 years since I became acquainted with Henry Thoreau's tract on civil disobedience. I read it with a strong feeling, this is something that directly concerns me. But only very much later did I understand from where that feeling came. It was the concrete, the personal, the here and now in the writing that won my heart for it. Thoreau did not formulate a general principle as such. He set forth and grounded his attitude in a particular historical biographical situation. He spoke to his reader in the realm of this situation common to them, so that the reader not only learned why Thoreau at that time acted as he acted, but also, provided that the reader was only honest and unbiased, that he himself, the reader, must have acted, should the occasion present itself, in just such a way, if he was seriously concerned about making his human existence real. There's a point to pause at. In an essay on Gandhi, Buber once said, "No man should be either political or apolitical on principle." He has distinguished in a very important essay in Pointing the Way, called The State and Society, between what he calls the political principle and the social principle. And he says the political principle is much overemphasized in our day. It is the principle of domination. It is the principle of power. And it's always more power than is needed to hold together society. And it always uses the latent state of war between nation and nation as its justification. The social principle is a principle of fellowship. It builds not just individuals, but real community. And the domination of the political over the social stifles the real spontaneity of social life. That is why Buber felt that he could point, as he did, to Jerusalem, by which he meant the kibbutzim, these remarkable village communes with this almost religious relation, although they were secular, to the center of the commune, and this remarkable relation to each other, as the important alternative in our day to Moscow, by which he meant centralized, state-centralized socialism. On the one hand, in other words, a community of communities, not anarchy, not complete decentralism, but only as much political power as was necessary to hold unity. And on the other hand, a sort of a world unity, like Marx's withering away of the state, considered to be there forever, and in fact, suppressing all real social life. And I think we have very much in our country, in our democracy, fallen into the mistake of identifying the political and the social principles. Men like Bertrand Russell and even Reinhold Niebuhr. And a great many of us do this. When I graduated Harvard, I went down to Washington and spoke to a man about an internship in Washington. And he asked me where I was from, and I said I was from Oklahoma. And he said, well, why don't people from Oklahoma ever think of going back to Oklahoma and working there? Well, I figured he'd never been to Oklahoma, so he wouldn't have asked the question. But there was another thing. This was the era of the height of the New Deal, and I knew where the action was. It was in Washington. I was very much for Arthur Morgan's TVA, but I didn't really take in the fact that the whole purpose of TVA was to have a community there, to have a decentralization, to build small communities. But I think we have all learned, for example, since the Supreme Court decision on desegregation in 1954, that while you need the highest court of the land to lay down the political principle that there is no such thing as separate but equal, that it does not become social reality, except it becomes social reality on the level of actual social workings. We still have a long, bitter way to go before this becomes true in the South or in the North. But we now know, and we know from the new movements that have arisen, that important as the political is, it is not everything. That sometimes, whether it's a sit-down strike or it's young people walking into a restaurant or what have you, sometimes a direct social action, if it is not merely a fanatical thing which disregards the other, is a more meaningful form of social action and dialogue and a more meaningful living witness than any number of bills which are passed if these bills are not made living reality. This is not to set the one against the other, but is to say that no man should be political or apolitical on principle. And therefore, the link that Buber made in this last sentence where I paused, between taking the sort of stand that Thoreau did and becoming real in your human existence, is a link which says, at some point, you may, like Socrates, have to say, no man can be a public official in Athens with an honest man without going to his death and hold off from it. But at other points, you may, like Socrates, have to go up and say, I respect you, Athenians, but I will obey the gods, not you, and drink the cup of hemlock. Buber continues, it is not simply a question here of one of the many individual cases of the struggle of a powerless truth against a power that has become inimical to truth. It is a question of the wholly concrete indication of the point at which from time to time this struggle becomes the duty of man as man. Man is man, but man does not exist as man until he authenticates his existence as man, until he makes it real in situations of this sort. Because from his historical situation, Thoreau speaks as concretely as he does, he expresses in the right manner what is valid for all human history. Here Buber says something which is not dissimilar to his contrast between Isaiah and Plato. Plato gave us a timeless utopia in the Republic. Isaiah spoke into the depths of a particular concrete human situation, and therefore Isaiah speaks more directly to us today than Plato. Not that we are in his situation, we are in a very different one. And yet he who speaks in the depths of a situation may speak also to the depths of our situation, as the timeless and the universal never can. For utopia means nowhere. And in his book, Paths of Utopia, Buber distinguishes between that sort of utopian socialism, which is a programmatic thing based upon some design of the nature of man, and that which arises out of real situations, out of real needs, out of real community. In the same year, Buber wrote something called More on Civil Disobedience. And again, I think it's a very remarkable statement of a foreview that he had. Buber was not Bertrand Russell. He did not have war crimes trials for, though he was in correspondence with Russell, but he didn't have war crimes trials for President Johnson and the like. He didn't take strongly political positions, but he would not admit, for example, in 1952, when I submitted at his request his essay and hope for this hour to Partisan Review, he would not admit that he was radically unrealistic because he did not see the Cold War as the most basic reality in the world today. He said, on the contrary, the Cold War is merely the symptom of the existential mistrust that prevents one nation from speaking to another, one camp from speaking to another, that mistrust which already interprets what the other has to say as ideology. And it was this essay that the Partisan Review rejected as unrealistic that Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations, quoted at great length in 1958 when he was given an honorary doctorate at Cambridge University in England. Because, as Hammarskjöld said, Buber put it in words that I could not hope to emulate. And the words had to do with the way in which, at the United Nations, everyone spoke out the window. Not the social things, but the political, spoke out the window for home consumption. And how men did not really hear each other, and how each nation reduced the other to its own national interest and also to an ideologist who didn't lie deliberately, but had a mask positively imprinted on him, so he had to lie because he was a communist or a capitalist or from this bloc or from that bloc. In other words, Buber said, in our day, it's not just the mistrust that was always held of the stranger who wandered into the farmyard, the tramp say. A new sort of mistrust has arisen. The mistrust has become existential. It is a mistrust of existence itself. It is also a mistrust of eternity. And more on civil disobedience, Buber writes, I am ever again asked wherein, not in a particular historical situation, but wholly in general, civil disobedience can prove its legitimacy. To this I know, first of all, nothing else to answer than disobedience of such a nature is only legitimate if it is in truth obedience. More exactly, obedience to a higher authority than the one that the one here and now obeys. But now I shall be met with a new question. From where then do I know the command of this highest authority for this situation here and now? One can perhaps transpose this question into the language of the gospel parable. Where is the limit of that which I must at any time give to Caesar? This calls for an aside because Buber gave in 1957 an address called The Validity and Limitation of the Political Principle, and he based it mostly upon an interpretation of this remarkable saying of Jesus. You remember that Jesus was asked, should we pay taxes? And he said, show me a coin, and they did. And he said, whose picture is on the coin? And they said, Caesar's. And so he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And Buber points out, which is certainly the case, that this has regularly been interpreted as a sort of a dualism in which, on the one hand, you give Caesar all the political, the economic, and the social, and ordinary living, and then you give all the rest to God, which, as the Caesars managed it, meant nothing at all, of course, because by the time the Caesars were through, you were worshiping them too. Buber said he didn't believe it was that sort of principle at all. The whole point is that the coin is a form of trade. We live by it. It's not barter, but it's a form of exchange. We live in an indirect economic situation. We give coins for goods. and goods for coins, or services for coins, and coins for services, and so on. We live this way, and we cannot remove ourselves from it. And we must render this indirect relationship between men its due. But that does not mean it becomes an autonomous province not subject to the other. On the contrary, it is the part, and the other is not another part, but is the whole. And therefore, again and again, the means, the economic situation, the political situation, the international system, has to be brought into the end. And the end is immediacy, is social reality, or genuine dialogue, as Buber would put it. And that means that there is, after all, a check that you cannot have, to use the title of one of Reinhold Niebuhr's oldest books, which he would no longer probably ascribe to. You cannot have moral man and an immoral society and say we have one set of moral standards as men, but as members of the body politic, of course, we proceed in Machiavellian fashion. It doesn't mean that societies can be men and proceed exactly as men, but it means that you cannot be two men, one of whom is honest and a man of integrity in your private life, and the other whom is a liar, a scoundrel, a murderer, etc., in public, and still be a real man, a real human being, because the public has to be verified in the everyday, not just the private, but in the social. Every attempt, says Buber, to answer this question unassailably, that is a question of where is the limit of what I must at any time give to Caesar, every attempt to answer this question unassailably from the plane of a generally valid concept must end in failure. The absolute cannot show itself in our world as unconditionally superior to everything relative, because the mighty-voiced apes of the absolute understand how, with the requisite dialectical means, to demonstrate effectively their claims, each his own, in order to stigmatize the disobedient. In his essay on Kierkegaard's Suspension of the Ethical, Buber uses that phrase, the apes of the absolute. And he says, these are the false absolutes that lead us to brother murder for the sake of brotherhood, to lying for the sake of truth, and lead people to sacrifice their integrity in order that the kingdom may come, or equality may come, or liberty may come. Every Caesar, every Caesarism, no matter in what form it appears, every historically consistent power poses to its subjects as existing through grace, the grace of God, no matter what name this God may bear. Every society has always said, we are divinely sanctioned, and if you oppose us, you are opposing God. That's what they said to Socrates. You are an atheist, that is, you are attacking the traditional gods that uphold our society. It is therefore, Buber continues, finally necessary again for us to put an end to questioning and answering in general concepts, and to make it unmistakably clear that questioning and answering one must keep the situation constantly in sight, continually in sight. Not where at all times and in all places my obedient disobedience legitimately begins is what I have to say, but where it begins here and now. Yet in the situation in which we live, this has become easier to say than in any earlier situation of the human race. For man, through his own action, is on the point of letting the determination of his fate slip out of his hands. Those who today make all-embracing preparations, that means preparations for atomic hydrogen war and the like, deny themselves the image of what possibility opens up through just these preparations. It is the possibility that in the course of the mutually outstripping bellicose surprises on the side of both partners, so to speak, with a seeming continuation of human institutions, the most dangerous of our powers will autonomously continue the game until it succeeds in transforming the human cosmos into a chaos beyond which we can no longer think. Can the ruler of the hour command a halt to the machinery, the rulers of the hour, can they command a halt to the machinery which they only seemingly master? Will they still be able, at the right time, to avert the pan-technical war? In other words, instead of the usual political talking past one another about mighty fictions, will they learn to talk to one another about the reality? Will they be able to clarify with one another the real mutual interests, to compare those that are opposed and those that are in common, and from this comparison to draw the conclusions that already today every independent thinking person is able to draw. But if, as I think, the rulers of the hour cannot do this, who shall here, while there is still time, come to the rescue, if not the disobedient, those who personally set their faces against the power that has gone astray as such? Must not a planetary front of such civil disobedience stand ready, not for battle like other fronts, but for saving dialogue? But who are these, if not those who hear the voice that addresses them from the situation of the human crisis, and obey it? For a man who lived from situation to situation, Buber had a remarkable consistency. Perhaps in 1914 he was taken in by that spirit of some movement that was coming in the German war, but certainly ever after that, he knew, with deep understanding and also deep bitterness, the effects of a nationalism which swells itself up and claims to be something more than it is or can be. And he knew that power is not evil in itself, but it is evil when it proceeds unchecked without direction. And it was Martin Buber who, in 1921, at the Carlsbad Conference of Zionism, was the leader of those who strove to bring to the attention of the Zionist movement, which had just gotten the lift of the Balfour Declaration and the hope of perhaps establishing a homeland, to bring to their attention that there were Arabs in Palestine and in the surrounding countries, that these Arabs also were going to experience a national revival. In fact, that national revival was going to be stimulated in part through the revival of the Jewish people in Palestine. And that we have to live with the Arabs and not just next to them, or we shall find ourselves living against them. This was the second time where Buber entered into strong activity as a political Zionist, this time representing the A.D. Gordon's group of kibbutz Nakim and socialists from Israel and other places. And he reported many years later how even his friends got him to whittle down and whittle down and whittle down and whittle down for the sake of compromise, for the sake of this being accepted, until finally what was left was so watered down that it was meaningless and in any case was not put into effect. But all of Buber's essays on Zionism and his speeches for over 50 years said that the way cannot be reached except by mitzpah, by justice, and that if we try to go by some other way, then the end will be different from the end we think we are aiming at. And he could not be taken in by the notion that security or the political goal of the moment is going to do it. He never believed, as his friend Chaim Weizmann did, that the British were interested only for altruistic reasons in Palestine and the Jewish homeland. He always was skeptical about that. And when he long before he came to Israel, he belonged to the group called Bris Shalom, called the Covenant of Peace, that worked for Jewish-Arab rapprochement. And then in 1942, under the leadership of Judah Magnes, the founder of Hebrew University, he became one of the prime leaders of the group called Ikhud, a group for Jewish-Arab rapprochement. And until his death, was the spiritual leader of this group. Ikhud was not an anti-Zionist group. On the contrary, its leaders, like Buber himself, were very old-line Zionists, Chaim Kalvarisky and Magnus and many others, and Henrietta Zoll, the founder of Hadassah. But they said we have to be concerned in each new situation we cannot just accept punitive raids against the Arabs. We cannot just accept the Arabs being second-class citizens or reduced to some sort of felony. And we have to be concerned about social solutions for, let's say, the problem of the refugees. This was not mere utopianism, and it was not an open and shut case. Ikhud was never a powerful political group, but it had a moral voice. It was sometimes listened to and oftentimes not. It is still a very controversial subject in Israel, but it's not so simple as the simple Zionism and anti-Zionism, which are both political things that one finds in this country. Buber stood on that ground, and he also stood on the ground of meeting where possible in the situation. Buber was bitterly criticized because in 1953 he accepted the Peace Prize of the German book trade. He was criticized by the Israeli press. He was criticized by the Yiddish press in this country. He is still criticized today in Israel for this very thing. Although he did not take any money from it, and though there are many people who criticize him who have been supported by German reparations money and German Volkswagens for years, because it is a bitter subject. Even his closest friends, like Hugo Bergman and Ernst Simon, said in this case they pled with him not to. It is too early, they said. And these people will not understand, and we will not be teaching them. And Buber's response was, Ich muss die Reife prüfen stehen. Ich muss die Reife Prüfung stehen. I must stand the final examination, the mature test. What was that test? That test he saw in these terms. He says, I can never see, although I believe in the real existence of peoples, I can never see one people as just one thing. And he says, I cannot see all Germans simply as Nazis. And he said, and he spoke. He said, when I accept this prize, and the prize, the Goethe Prize at Hamburg, he said, I cannot do so without saying the spirit in which I do so. Speaking in 1953 in Frankfurt, he said, 12 years ago, millions of my people and fellow believers were executed in a systematic procedure, the organized cruelty of which had no precedent in human history. With those who took part in this action, I, one of the survivors, have only a formal humanity in common. For what they did so exceeded my capacity to imagine that I could not hate, much less overcome hatred. And what am I that I should here presume to forgive? But he also spoke of others, some who heard rumors and were afraid to investigate, and he said, I cannot find it in my heart to condemn people for not becoming martyrs, all the way to those who, as he knew from personal evidence, the many who refused to take part in it and committed suicide or were murdered. And with them, he said, my heart stands in a special bond at this time. And he said, in every people there runs a front of the human opposed to the anti-human. And we have to stand with them, especially where the never to be overcome opposition to what happens makes we feel most strongly. I, the Arch-Jew, and he was speaking of the word which Hitler and the Nazis used of him, I, the Arch-Jew, must, nonetheless, as a symbol, accept this to stand with these against those. And it was no joke at that time. Albrecht Guss, the German pastor, represented the human side in the Germans, but there was a whole resurgence of neo-Nazis who, talking about the American examinations and so on, said, really, there were only 1 million Jews killed, it wasn't so bad, and so on. Even to this day, of course, there is still this problem. This is what Buber means by genuine dialogue and the possibilities of peace. It's what he said to Gandhi when Gandhi in 1938, in his newspaper Harijan, said that the Jews were wrong and inhuman to impose themselves upon the Arabs. Buber said this is not true. We didn't steal the land, we bought it. But he went on to say here are two claims of an entirely different nature, and they cannot be compared with each other. We have to stand our claim of the biblical covenant, and we have to recognize the claim that is opposed to ours, and we have to seek reconciliation, not from above, but from in this situation. When there is faith and love, he said, there might, even in a tragic situation, be a possibility of reconciliation. And the same was true of his stand in relation to the Germans. He had reason to know what Hitler and the Nazis were because he was the leader, along with Leo Beck, of the German Jews, the spiritual leader in their spiritual resistance against the Nazis. From 1933 until 1938, when Buber, deprived of every opportunity to teach, to speak, to work with groups, finally went to Palestine and to Hebrew University. And he was the symbol to countless thousands of the man who went to Berlin at the height of the Nazi period with 2,000 SS men sitting in the audience and delivered his speeches attacking collectivism and standing for the spirit of Israel. But he did not hold that anything was served by simply perpetuating this. A good example of this is his relation to the philosopher Martin Heidegger. In his book, Eclipse of God and Religion and Modern Thought, Buber points out that Heidegger, one of the great philosophers of our time, the great existentialist philosopher, more than any man, more than any philosopher, fell into the snares of the historical by identifying his historical hour with Hitler, the Lord of the hour. Now, Buber told me that an editor of Merkur, a very distinguished magazine, journal in Berlin that published this, asked Buber if he wouldn't mind removing those words. And he said, after all, the wounds have been so great, you know. Buber said, but he was talking to me about metaphorical wounds, but I was talking about real wounds. But then, having said that, and not just said it as, by the way, he was a Nazi, but rather that his thought itself fell directly into Nazism. And there is indeed evidence of this. I have put in my book, The Worlds of Existentialism, 8 pages at the end, to raise this issue about Heidegger's thought. Having said that, then later, when he was asked in Munich to come and to speak with Heidegger on speech, he agreed to do so. And some people were shocked, and he said, but I have said what I had to say against him. He did not, in fact, speak with him. He became ill and couldn't do so. But this is, again, an example of the way in which he lived. Now, genuine dialogue, Buber suggests, is the alternative to war. For war always comes with the cessation of real speech between peoples. And the great peace is not merely the Cold War. It is that which is built, that which rules over all the virtues. He points out to the mural in Siena, that which is built through this dialogue. And what is genuine dialogue in the case of international conflict? It means a human arbitration where the real leaders of people come together out of the camps and distinguish between the real and the exaggerated needs of the peoples. And it does not mean love, but it does mean confirming the opponent's right to exist, to stand where he is, even in opposing him. And one can only contrast this with the traditional political attitude of ourselves and every nation, which is always to turn it into an either-or. We have to destroy the other to exist ourselves. And again, it was this that struck Dag Hammarskjöld, who wrote me, that he wanted to translate into Swedish many of the essays in the Politics, Community, and Peace part of Buber's Pointing the Way, because they made a great contribution, a major contribution to social problems of our times, and he wanted it to be more broadly known. And the contribution was a pointing to dialogue as a third alternative to the politicizing of existence. In fact, when I wrote to Buber what the editor of Partisan Review had said about hope for this hour being unrealistic because it didn't see everything in terms of either Russia or the United States, he wrote a little postscript, which you'll find today in Pointing the Way, called Abstract and Concrete. And he spoke about the political catchwords which dominate the atmosphere, and which, if we allow them to continue, will lead to the technically perfect suicide of mankind. The alternative to this is to rediscover in each situation the actual social principles. Buber came in person and later sent his, those who were spiritually akin when he couldn't do so, to the Florence conferences that La Pia, the former mayor of Florence, sponsored, which was the only meeting where, for example, Buber got up at the Presidium with an Egyptian philosopher and really spoke about political problems, and as Buber wrote me, had a very real dialogue with each other. He tried to do what he could, and he did not accept anything which so politicized the situation that it forced you into being the one thing or the other. Now, I called the title of this lecture, Let Us Dare to Trust. That is, in fact, from the final sentence of the essay Hope for This Hour. What is the hope for this hour? When we have seen through our seeing through, and when we no longer just try to unmask, when we put things in their place, and we see men with clear-eyed trust, knowing that they are open and hidden both, and not simply trying to interpret them by the economic or the psychological thing we have discovered. And when we can again discover a way to turn toward each other in dialogue, then the hinderer, Satan, is the man who prevents, or the people, or whoever it is, who prevents you from turning in dialogue to the other. And therefore, it is not a question of you must trust or you can trust, but let us dare to trust. And trust, existential trust, is the real heart of Martin Buber's life of dialogue and of his encounter on the narrow ridge. It's the heart of every distinction that he makes between I, thou, and I, it, between emunah, unconditional trust in the relation with God, and pistis, the faith which is a knowledge proposition, between the prophetic which calls to the everyday and the apocalyptic which predicts a certain future, between devotio which meets the situation with whole response and gnosis which tries to comprehend and embrace it. It is as a pointing to trust that Martin Buber stands before us as a man, not as a saint, but in this sense an image of man. I have never yet met, he said, a young man who seemed to me a bad seed, evil. Later on, when there is layer upon layer of seeming, then indeed it seems to be a nature, an evil nature. But there, even the foreground perspective is mistaken. Man as man is redeemable. Now we have time for comments and questions. Please. Yes, could you stand up and say it? It might carry it better. Could you stand up and say it? Yes. Yes. It's a very good question, which I'll repeat briefly in case some of you couldn't hear it. If it is true that that those who are confirmed thereby gain the confidence and sense of identity, would not this very confidence enable some to trust, and the lack of it disenable others from trusting? And would not, therefore, Jesus' somber word be confirmed that the rich get richer and the poor poorer? To some extent, this is true. And there's no blinking it. Nothing breeds success like success. The man of great confidence picks up still more things as he goes along, until maybe one day in Dallas, someone on top of a building takes out a gun and shoots into the open car, where he felt he didn't need a bulletproof glass over. But it is not simply a determinism. Confirmation, as Buber puts it, is the heavenly bread that one man gives another, that shy thing which he waits for, which enables him to say yes to being, which enables him to be. Nor does it happen once for all. I didn't mean to imply that. And it is never done happening. And if we had not had some confirmation, we would not be persons at all. Think as blackly about your parents as you may, they gave you something, or you wouldn't be a human being. So that what we often imagine to be the bottom is merely a trapdoor, and we can fall through many more trapdoors, in fact, without reaching the dead bottom. We have more resources than we think. And sometimes our lack of resources is precisely our image of ourselves as not having the resource. And therefore the word, let us dare to trust, becomes a very important word. For the man who says, I can't, he says it as a hesitation, he says it as a question, he says it as an agony. Now, it's not just a matter of saying you can, but there might be a moment's wavering, and maybe something that you could give him too, where he could shed for a second his image of himself as someone who could not, and at least discover what he could do. Because many of us are weighted down by our images of ourselves, our feelings that we cannot. I'm not talking about sort of positive thinking and auto-suggestion and saying I'm great and that sort of thing. I am talking only about getting rid of an attitude which freezes our resources in a moment of response, because, in fact, it makes us preoccupied with ourselves and more interested in the fact of our failure than in that which calls to us to respond. I don't know if I mentioned it. I was thinking, I was lecturing out in California, And if one carried Buber's thought far enough, one wouldn't say there was such a thing as potentiality within a person at all. Potentiality is always between you and the situation. And you really don't know from one situation to another what will give you resources and what will cut it off. And therefore, although there are facts which perhaps cannot be gainsaid, there is an important middle level in which it matters to dare to trust. Buber says in I Am Thou, the only thing that makes man unfree is his belief that he is unfree. Why? Because it robs him of the sense of himself as a person and makes him think of himself as merely conditioned. There's something else, too. That which we call obvious confidence in success often, of course, masks something else. And when the chips are down, it isn't always the people who are the most obviously confident and successful who, in fact, have the resources. If something can call to you so deeply that you forget yourself, you may surprise yourself. Yes, please. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, one distinction between you and me is you speak objectively. I cannot. I was for 3 years the chairman of the American Friends of Equud, a group to support this, because I really believed in it. And therefore, anything I say should be held against me. I do not believe that Israel has done all that it could do, and I believe that the two gentlemen whom you mentioned, Abba Eban and Ben-Gurion, are excellent examples of what I'm talking about. For they are both supremely political men, very good men and very intelligent men, but they are supremely political. I once heard Abba Eban at the New School, which is my old hangout all the way down on 12th Street, heard him say, someone asked a question in the audience, and they said, what about the problem of the refugees? You know, even the question of the number of the refugees is a great political question. The Arabs say it's 1 million, the Jews say it's 400 or 600,000, and in any case, we all know that nothing has been done about those refugees, that they have festered there, they have lived there for over a generation now, that it's the great political sore that is kept up, and so forth. But Abba Eban was asked about this, and he said, and Ben-Gurion has often said the same thing, I heard that it was said recently on television here, when the war started, the Arab radio said to the Arabs to flee. They did flee. The land became ours. Therefore, the problem is not our problem, it's their problem. Now, I believe that he's correct in everything except the conclusion. That is, I think they were told to flee, and they did flee. They were afraid. It was a situation of hostility. They didn't all flee, by the way. Some stayed, some didn't. Some who, by the way, didn't flee out of Palestine, just left another place, also lost their lands. Big problem. All these lands were taken over. But that doesn't mean it is not a common problem. It is a real, a terrible problem, a festering problem. Now, as far as what Israel can do, the first thing is that Israel has always been ready to make political peace, which would have meant recognizing Israel politically as existing, which is, of course, the position which the Arabs do not accept. On the other hand, I do not think Israel has been ready enough to do social measures or to do the sort of things that Ehud is called for by way of calling an international presence in Jerusalem to arbitrate the problem of the refugees and so on. That is, there is a distinction between political readiness to talk and the social at every given level. Someone said to me about the UN, I'm sure it's true. Many, many people from many nations work together very successfully and meaningfully at the UN on the social level. It's only the top people who represent their countries where it becomes so politicized that it's more and more difficult to work. I think the same is true here. Now, where I think that there has been failure on the Israeli side, never as gross as the Arabs, because the Arabs do say, the Arab nations do say, Israel doesn't exist, we're going to run it into the sea. But where there has been failure, I believe, is precisely in each new situation not doing as much as could be done. I think Levi Eshkol is nearer that. The former prime minister, who may have lost his prime ministership partly on this, Moshe Sharet, he was in fact much closer to it than Ben-Gurion was, who was usually taking a much more strident position. Now, when I said, or quoted Buber as saying, speaking about the Arabs as second-class citizens, I only meant that they did not have the full rights of first-class citizens, which is a fact. It is said by Eshkol that at some future time this will be changed. Hopefully it will. That was one of the political matters that was in the last campaign, but it hasn't yet. It's been postponed. That means that the Arabs in Israel live under military government, that there are many places they are not allowed to go to, that suspicion is on them as a whole, that they can only have certain jobs and not other jobs, and that in many ways they are not, in fact, treated as first-class citizens. That is simply, I think, a matter of fact. It is not denied by any Israeli. The issue only is, can you let them have these privileges without endangering security? That's where the whole problem comes in. But many people have felt, not just Yichud, but within the government itself, the whole of Onafer and other things, have felt that security has been overly pushed as being sort of the be-all and end-all of everything in the government. Now, when my wife and I were in Israel, by not entirely a coincidence, but by happy, what Jung would call, synchronicity, rather. By happy synchronicity, there was a film being made by a film team of the National Educational Television on more or less Buber's dialogue with Israel. Buber wasn't alive, it was mostly Israel, but seeing the issues that were raised. And we saw, just last Friday, the rough cut, the first assemblage of this film, and there was a very impressive Arab speaking there who was a member of the Knesset. He said, what we want is equality. We want to feel equal in every sense. You could not doubt his sincerity. And at the same time, he said that as an Arab, he could not imagine fighting for Israel against the Arabs. I think that puts the tragedy in a nutshell. But don't forget that the Arab nations are one thing, and the Arabs in Israel, although they have tribal relations over the borders, this is what we're talking about when we speak of second-class citizens. We're not talking about the Arabs in the other countries. It is a tragic problem. The question is, has as much been done as could be done? And what I call political Zionism is where you deal with it only in terms of large political things. Let us recognize them and this. I don't know if I mentioned to you, but to me it was very impressive. Buber said, to the Jewish Peace Fellowship, when I got him to speak to them, they said, why don't you have unilateral disarmament in Israel? And he said, well, because the first day the Bedouins would look on amazement, and the second day they would ride in. When in 1960, when my wife and I were in Jerusalem, Buber told us that Charles Malik, the United Nations representative from Lebanon, a distinguished professor of philosophy and writer, had visited the Israeli pavilion in Brussels in the World's Fair by mistake. Had signed his name on the register. This had been picked up by the press, and from that moment on he ceased. In fact, has since to this day ceased to have any official position. Because no one in an Arab state can recognize the existence of Israel without immediately losing a position to the person below. But when Reinhold Niebuhr and I secretly wrote to about 29 people, or was it? No, it wasn't 29. It was 19 people around the world to support Dag Hammarskjöld's nomination of Buber for a Nobel Prize in Literature. One of the people that I did write to was Charles Malik, and I thought, him I will not blame if he doesn't respond, and I was sure he wouldn't. But instead he did respond, and in fact added a long note to the Nobel Prize Committee saying if the Arabs and the Israelis could meet in the spirit of Martin Buber, there could be peace between them. Now, this is not a general program. It's only a plea for looking at the situation step by step. And it is perfectly true that the Arab nations are not ready to recognize the existence of Israel politically. It is also true, though, that Israel is there, that the solid front has split, that Bourguiba has said it looks like Israel might be here for a while, and that things are changing. And Buber said, and I think it's worth thinking about, that today, perhaps, no one can talk, but tomorrow, if the Cold War changes, that whole situation might change in the Middle East. And the realism he proposed was that which was ready to talk if and when talk became possible. But when an Arab member of the Ihud came to Buber, when the war did break out between the Jews in Palestine and the Arab nations, and said, what shall we do? Buber said, go home. Us they will stone, but you they will kill. He was a realist. Yes. Oh, thank you very much. You were very kind. I've enjoyed being here with you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.